got Kyle back, and one of the shows that we did was with Fikowski, Luke Way, Andrew Sellers, and we talked about a lot of different things as it relates to respiratory training and the Breathe Way Better. And Kyle and I think both had a bunch of learnings from that we've kind of stuck with us, and it's just something we kind of wanted to talk about. I don't think we've talked about it specifically at length, so this will be just kind of be our opportunity to do some takeaways from that conversation.
Yeah, I think I had, first off, if you haven't listened to that podcast, go back and listen to that podcast before you listen to this, because there was so much information delivered in that episode that there's no way we're going to be able to recount all of it. And a lot of it, I think, is fundamental to understanding what we'll probably talk about here. But I think one of the biggest takeaways that I had from that, and it has fundamentally changed how I'm training my athletes' breathing specifically, was that I was skipping a whole bunch of steps. And rather than focusing on helping my athletes take bigger, deeper breaths and then layering on respiratory frequency, the speed of breathing, I was just jumping straight to speed of breathing and having people breathe with like a much smaller portion of their lungs, a much smaller portion of their functional lung volume than they can use. And I think before we go on, we probably should back up and very briefly explain the physiology of breathing, in a sense that if you don't understand what exactly is going on, none of the things that we're going to talk about are going to make any sense. So when you take a breath in, you can use any percentage of your total lung volume. Like you can take a breath in and you can use 10% of your lung volume. That might be a very shallow upper chest breath like that. People that were watching would have been able to see that. Anybody listening, it was a very small.
They could hear.
Yeah, very small breath. Or you can take a full breath and fill up your entire lung volume. Someone might have 6 or 7 or 8 liters of functional lung volume, where if you breathe in all of that, you're going to get a lot more air. Okay? So if you think about exercise from...
Can I take it a step further?
Yeah, go ahead.
So 2 of the things that Luke did a pretty good job of explaining this, but respiratory muscles are interesting in a way that their set point is sort of in the middle, where it's it takes effort to inflate the lungs. It takes effort to compress the lungs and squeeze the air out. And then you're set, if you take a big breath in and you just let it go, you're kind of sitting at a half full lung, essentially, where you have to work to empty it out. You have to work to fill it back up. So first of all, it's going to take more energy to go all the way up to the extremes of filling it up all the way to the top. And it's going to take energy to lower it, to expel all of your air and spit it out. But there's also dead space, which makes this interesting. So you can't exchange any gas in your trachea. So you're only exchanging gas when it actually reaches into your lungs. And
there's a sweet spot at the bottom of your lungs where the most gas is exchanged.
Yes.
So the extra effort that's expended to fill the lung fully means that you are offloading more CO2 and onboarding more oxygen, because that part of the lung just absorbs more oxygen and releases more CO2. So you have to get past that neutral point in order to breathe effectively. And the way that most people breathe is, like you said, in the dead space, the trachea space. Most of the breathing that people do is very shallow. It never goes past that kind of diaphragm midpoint. And so the majority of what they're exchanging is just in the trachea, where no actual gas exchange takes place. So all of the breathing that they're doing is kind of wasted breathing.
Yeah. I don't know. You can think of it as the first, just making up a number, first 10% of your breath every time, or it wouldn't be as a percentage. So it would be there's a set amount, and then the percentage of that total breath is reduced the bigger breath that you take. So if it's, just to keep the math really simple, if it's 100 milliliters and you take a 1 liter breath, it's 10%, that would be dead space. If you double your breath, is 2-liter breath. Now it's only 5%, for example.
And it's still only the original 100 milliliters of dead space. So essentially, what we're getting at and what they talked about on that episode and explained much better than you and I.
we fumbled our way through it.
Yeah, much better than we can. What they're basically saying is that an effective breath is a deep breath, period. And that at high, so there's another concept that needs to be explained here. And that is that at high intensities, our oxygen consumption goes up. And you could measure this with a VO2 test. You put a VO2 mask on someone and ask them to gradually increase their exercise intensity across 10 minutes or 12 minutes. And you're going to see the amount of oxygen that their body is consuming measured by VO2 increase across that time, to the point that someone might be consuming, like an elite athlete might be consuming 60 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. So I'm going to do some math, Ben, if you want to pick up there, and I'll tell you exactly how much oxygen that is that the body's utilizing.
Yeah. I'll quick go into what I had sort of like an analogy of how I was thinking about their main takeaway here, which is like, generally speaking, a larger breath is more efficient, especially once you've trained it. Like up front, it might be a little bit costly for the athlete to go through that. So it might not be something that they can default to all the time. But if you can train it to the point where it is something that they can, have the bandwidth to kind of take on in a workout situation, then like that's going to be the most efficient way to do it. My maybe comparison from like a physiology standpoint was like, to keep it super simple, their idea was that you have to ventilate as much as possible. Like minute ventilation needs to be as high as you can. My comparison to that was like, okay, let's take that and compare it to like cardiac output, where the goal is just like you want as much blood coming out of the heart in a minute as you possibly can. Where one of those two, it's got the equation is two different things that equals that cardiac output, right? It's stroke volume, the amount that's coming out of the heart on each beat, and it is your heart rate. So how fast, how many times the heart is beating. And that's what gets you the cardiac output. It's like one of those has productive ceiling on it, right? Your heart rate can only go so high with it still actually working correctly. So it's like
there is a max heart rate, right?
There is a max heart rate. And even if like for some reason you could drive it up to an artificial number some way, the heart isn't filling up correctly. So it's not a productive increase.
Yeah. In the end, it's not functional, right?
Yes.
Functional cardiac output didn't improve.
Yep. So it's like the other side of the equation is stroke volume. So that's what you try to increase as much as you possibly can. And that's how you get your cardiac output to go up. Whereas like for the ventilation equation, to get as much ventilation as you can, there's productive ceiling to respiratory rate. So how many times you're breathing, because you can only, I think this is the way Sellers put it, is like you can only cycle through your dead space so many times. Like if you're taking 60 breaths a minute, you're cycling through that twice every second. So you have a half-second inhale, half-second exhale.
And they kind of used 60 as like the
cutoff.
The kind of, above that point, you're not really getting much out of each breath.
Yeah. So same idea as like respiratory rate has a productive ceiling to it. So then you have to increase the other side of the equation, which is your tidal volume. So trying to maximize the volume of air that you're taking on each inhale and exhale.
And so I think like I was saying, the big takeaway for me is that I was approaching the equation backwards, that I was trying to build endurance at high frequencies, 50 to 60 breaths per minute with my athletes, rather than taking a step back and increasing, expansion, basically making it so that using more of their lung was more effective. And just going back and teaching that to athletes has made all the respiratory training that I've been doing much more effective, because rather than taking in, let's say using, simple examples, if they're getting like 2 liters of air with each breath at, 50 breaths per minute, they're getting 100 liters of air in that minute, versus now you're doing 4 filling up their lungs completely, they're getting 4 liters of air with each breath. So 200 liters of air exchanged. So all of a sudden they go from having a limiter being oxygen exchange because they can't get enough oxygen in and CO2 out in a minute to no longer having that be a limiter for them. The other thing to keep in mind is like, you mentioned the 60 breaths per minute as sort of like a ceiling for people, but in CrossFit, a lot of the movements don't allow you to breathe faster than the rep cadence of the movement. And so you're almost limited in the sense that you can only breathe at 30 breaths per minute for a particular movement or 45 breaths per minute for a particular movement. And so the more air you can exchange with each breath, the higher the intensity that you're going to be able to maintain, the higher the power output you're going to be able to maintain, because your oxygen consumption will be higher. You'll be taking in more and able to utilize more of what you've taken in.
Yeah, so if it's like a rep takes you, probably sweet spot for many athletes, if it's just like a traditional movement that's not like super highly loaded or something, say it takes them a second and a, or 1.5 to 2 seconds, it's like, by master, right, that'd be like 30 to 45 breaths a minute. So like that'd be a pretty comfortable 1 breath per rep of the movement if you're doing, thrusters or toes to the bar, like those sorts of movements. Again, provided it's not like at a crazy high power output.
Yeah, I think about it like on a GHD sit-up where there's even a breath hold built into the movement. At the very back, you have to have a momentary brace where you can't inhale or exhale. So you've got this momentary breath hold for each one. And then if you factor that in, then really you only have a limited portion of each movement where you can actively be breathing. Like you said, thruster, you can't breathe in and breathe out at any point you want in the middle of a thruster at anything beyond kind of 95 pounds.
Yeah, I was just going to say, except for a certain weight, yeah.
Yeah, below a certain weight you can, but for most movements, you're limited to these little windows within the movement where you can inhale and exhale. And so then it comes down to how quickly can you get air into the functional spaces of your lungs and out of the functional spaces of your lungs. And so again,
when the bar's also sitting on your collarbones.
Yeah, I had this conversation with someone the other day. It's like we were talking about breathing, and you talk about front rack. Why front rack is so hard to breathe in? Well, it's like, well, yeah, you've got 225 pounds or 155
sitting
basically
on your ribs,
pressing down on your chest, and you're already a chest breather, so you're trying to inhale and lift your ribs against the load that's resting on your collarbones. Like, of course that's hard.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the big takeaway for me is everybody pretty much across the board should be training expansion. And once you've got to the point that you can inhale past that kind of diaphragm midpoint and get access to the deeper parts of your lungs more freely, once that's something that just feels kind of natural for you, then the challenge is to build strength, speed, and endurance in the muscles that pull the air all the way down there. And then it's to do it, once you've done that, the next step is to do it in sport-specific movements, is to learn how to breathe efficiently and effectively in all the different sport positions, which in this sport's really hard to do because there's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in your defense, I don't think you were on the wrong thing. Like, I think it's still necessary to know how to coordinate fast breathing, because it's obviously a super important skill, and a lot of people just aren't comfortable breathing fast. So it's not like it's not a useful skill. It's just that you should prioritize the depth of the breath before you prioritize the rate of the breath.
I looked at it like this, and I still think, like you said, I probably wasn't doing like a bad thing. I just could have done it more effectively. There's always something to look at it like that. But I was trying to improve breathing coordination, because most people have a point at which, and what I've found, having now had a lot of people go through Breathe Way Better progressions and doing step tests and stuff, it's around 50 breaths per minute. Beyond that, they don't effectively coordinate breathing. They might be able to continue to breathe on a cadence if they're using the breathe way better at 50 or 55 breaths per minute, but they're not getting much movement of air. And you can see that the bag's barely inflating, deflating. So they're going, but there's no air being exchanged. Like, yeah, they're breathing at the cadence that the metronome shows, but they're not actually exchanging very much volume of air. And in the end, it's the total volume of air that matters. So what I was trying to do is get people to coordinate their breathing and say, hey, deflate that bag and inflate that bag as much as possible. Go as high as you possibly can. And what that did is, in the short term, it just made them more comfortable holding higher respiratory frequencies. The danger was that I was potentially training them to hold higher respiratory frequencies with very low lung volume and total volume exchange, and that would be the problem. I think most people understood after a couple of rounds of like, hey, you're barely moving that bag, you need to empty the bag, you need to fill the bag. They understood like, hey, I really do need to get the biggest breaths I can and do it fast. There's something to be said for breathing coordination, but I don't think it's the panacea that I had 3 years ago when I first started using the Breathe Way Better had originally thought it was, because it made a huge difference for me. But I also knew that I should be breathing with big breaths.
And also, like, as a tool, it kind of is marketed the way that, like, hey, you could breathe fast and without passing out. So it's like, why wouldn't you? Like, that's the tool. Whereas, like, yeah, you're still breathing at sport-specific cadences, but the goal should be to drive the volume.
I really paid attention when I was at the age group games. I tried to pay attention to respiratory frequency because my heart rate monitor captures it, and I really do kind of settle around 40 to 45 in most metcons. And
your lungs are bigger than mine.
They definitely are. I mean, they definitely are. Why do you think I was a swimmer? I mean,
yeah. I mean, I just, like, as I'm thinking about this, like, the movement that's probably historically in CrossFit, a lot of caveats here, challenged my breath the most, I think, has been rowing. Because, like, it's been something that I've continued to develop, and it's often the thing in workouts that it's like, if your best example is like 24-2, 23-2, whichever one was like the rowing of 300 meters, it was like a 20-minute AMRAP.
Yeah, I think that was 24.
24-2. You're not going to make back any real time on that. Nothing meaningful relative to like having to break the deadlifts or to break the double unders. Like, especially when you're rowing for meters, you're better off just kind of rowing at the pace you want to row at, which means that you're pushing the outside movements more, which often happens to something like a cyclical movement in a metcon. It's like, hey, let the run be recovery and then come in and do this unbroken and that unbroken and get back out in the run again and try to recover yourself, right? Which, when that happens for the rower, it's like your CO2 is through the roof and you're trying to ventilate as much as you need to sustain the movement. So for me, that's just been a challenge over the years. It's like, if I'm rowing at 28 to 30 strokes a minute, my next option of breathing is to jump it where I'm doing 2 breaths per stroke, and now I'm at 54 to 60. For me, I've tried so many times to drop it down to 1-to-1 and just breathe at 28 or 30 breaths a minute, which like probably like 98% of people, maybe 99% of people listening to this have probably only ever done. I just can't default to that. Like, I've tried so many times. So it's like, maybe for me, and maybe I'm just venting right now, but maybe for me it's like at like my options are to breathe at like maybe 80%, 70% of my full lung volume at 54 to 60, or I can go at 90% at 28 to 30. And again, for me, maybe it's just a little bit more efficient to not breathe the full volume, but breathe at that high frequency so I can feel like I can actually keep my head above water.
Yeah, I think that you're probably solving the problem as best you can for your body size. Like,
thank you, Kyle. I can sleep now.
I don't think that first off, when you're seated on a rower, like, your diaphragm's compressed and you're kind of hunched over, you're leaned forward, you're probably not able to sit up fully. So like, expanding your diaphragm period is hard, right? And so part of breathing well on the rower is being able to expand your posterior ribs, Well, what we know about you is that the mid thoracic and everything's a little bit stiff. And so I don't think your posterior ribs move all that well. So the best solution for you is to double breathe on the row, right? Inhale, exhale on the way in, inhale, exhale on the way out. And I just don't think that that's that big of an issue unless you are getting to the point that you're like over breathing, blowing off so much CO2 that you're actually causing like a shift in your oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. And like then it would create a problem, but you're recovering, you're blowing off the adequate amount of CO2 to make it so that you're getting back to like a baseline during recovery rows. So I don't think it's as big of an issue as it could be. I also think a lot of it comes down to mechanics. Like I have found it very hard to breathe on the rower, but a lot of times if I let my knees splay out a little more, then my ribs fit in between. I've got a big rib cage, so like I got a lot of lung inside there, and it's hard to expand when it's compressed against my thighs. You know what I mean? And like same problem, my posterior ribs don't expand as well as some other athletes, especially when they're under tension with the row handle. And like it's hard to breathe. I've felt
I know you've played around with like the reverse breathing on the rower.
Yeah, I have. I've played around with reverse breathing. I actually have played around with the
What do you do now? Like if you're just going to go row in a Metcon and it was like a test, what are you going to do?
I'm just linked up 1-to-1 for the most part.
And but is it like the traditional like exhale like during the drive phase?
Yeah, it's still exhale during the drive, inhale on the way in. I've played with doing the reverse breathing, but I never could get it to stick as a habit.
Yeah, that's how I've also played around with it, and it just doesn't feel very. And part of it's just probably based on experience level, but especially when it's higher power output rowing, that doesn't feel comfortable.
You know, I talked to Becky Rogers, she's obviously a fantastic rower. Holds, I think, some Masters world records in various rowing things. And she always finds it really weird that we talk about connecting our breathing to the row stroke. Like she just breathes while she's rowing whenever she wants. And I can't figure out
what's her shortest time trial.
They're long, man.
Yeah. Maybe that's the only reason why you could do that. But then also I feel like it's not a big deal to breathe at a 1-to-1 if you're in a long time trial.
Maybe. I mean, her stroke rates are pretty low. She maintains very, very low stroke rates during the longer stuff. So, I think it would be more crazy to imagine that you'd be breathing, like if you're rowing like a 22 cadence, that you'd be breathing on a 22 cadence you're rowing fast and then only breathing 22 breaths per minute. That's so low. And especially if you're doing like 2K repeats at 22 breaths per minute, that is so incredibly low that I think you just have to learn to disconnect your breathing, which is something, if you think about runners, if you have someone start doing nose breathing running, a lot of people, they run on a cadence where it's like 2 in, 2 out, where it's like, they're doing steps and it's like that kind of thing. As soon as you get people nose breathing running, like they no longer have a cadence that they connect their breathing to. It's just their inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. I actually have talked to people about this with double unders and used nose breathing double unders, not in Metcons, just like in training, as a way to disconnect their breathing from the actual movement itself. So maybe that's where we need to go with you, is to do I've used the Breathe Way Better to help build awareness of breathing on rowing. You don't actually pull the handle, you just slide with the bag and try and get yourself into positions and really focus on full inhales, full exhales, and breathe on a cadence, but don't slide on a cadence. And that could potentially help you disconnect it. But again, I don't know how necessary that is. I don't know if that's going to be like, if you think about return on investment for training time, I don't know how good of a return on investment sliding around on the rower seat with a Breathe Way Better actually is.
I don't know. Sounds like a good sell. Yeah. That is the challenge though. It's like we just talked for how many minutes about rowing with breathing, right? And there's people who spend their entire career on that, but then you have 50 different movements that you got to do this with. And it's not only about doing that on its own, it's about doing it mixed with other stuff And each one, you're going to have different levels of fatigue and different types. So it's extremely complicated very quickly.
Yeah. So if you think about it, the different types of breathing that you could encounter in CrossFit would include seated breathing, which might be bike seated or rowing seated. And the more compact or more crunched up you are, the more it's got to be posterior rib. And the more kind of upright you are like a bike, the more it can be diaphragm. And the more supported you are, so like echo, it's going to be less diaphragm, more rib than holding on with, a Concept 2 bike holding onto the handles where you're like actually supported. So there's seated breathing. Then there's like running and dynamic breathing, which is like double unders and running, where you're like actively bracing your spine and breathing at the same time while bounding over and over and over. Then you've got like barbell breathing, where overhead breathing is very different than front rack breathing, which is very different than back rack breathing. But with all of them, there's going to be cycles of bracing and relaxing within there in order to be able to breathe. Then you're going to have like belt breathing, where you're doing all of those things with a belt on that changes the dynamics of your breathing. And then you have movements like toes to bar, where there's almost like built-in expansion of the rib cage and contraction of the rib cage. Same with GHDs. Like there's points where it's easier to breathe and harder to breathe within the movement. So you probably need to learn how to connect your breathing to that. Then there's breathing where you're laying flat on your chest, which is like burpees. And so you need to figure out how to...
Or hopefully not.
Yeah, or don't breathe there, breathe in other places within the movement. But like my point being, I just covered a very small subset of the movements in the sport. And you can see that like every one of them requires a very different type of breathing. And I think in the end, if you come back to good principles of breathing, which is you need to breathe deep and be able to breathe fast and be able to breathe slow and do it while you're braced and relaxed. If you can build those skills, you're going to have adaptable breathing, which is what is important for sport performance in CrossFit.
All right. One more question for you then. Like, that was a lot. How practically might you like implement that? Like, is that like, hey, you got a young athlete, let them do some CrossFit and like figure it out. Like, you got to get some experience under your belt, versus like formal teaching how to breathe in movements versus like intervals where you're focused on certain things. How might someone think about integrating that?
I think if I had someone that came to me and they were 15 or 16 and they're like, hey, they already were, well-versed in CrossFit, and they wanted to, their aspiration is to be a CrossFit Games athlete eventually, I'd probably have them buy a Breathe Way Better and start training with it for the purposes of learning to breathe with the full lung and being able to train respiratory frequency. But it wouldn't be like high priority, in their training. It would be a tool that we're using for warm-ups and cool-downs, where they consistently are using it because they, I think there's some value in it. Outside of that, I would absolutely be teaching them that there are different ways to breathe within the sport. Like transition breathing is big, deep, fast breathing, but then movement breathing is often connected to the movement. And you need to understand that there's going to be places within each movement that you can inhale and places within each movement that you can exhale. And your job is to figure out what works best for you.
Yep. This is one of those where it's like, there's going to be some people just do so much of this naturally well.
Yeah.
And there's going to be other people who just need to work and claw at getting every little bit of performance they can. And I guess our job is to help both.
Yeah. I think the majority of people breathe really badly. That like breathing is so poor. And they do need some help to learn, because the habit or the general trend that I found is most people, they can't expand the diaphragm. They can only breathe to neutral. And it takes months of work to get them to unlock the rest of that breathing. And it's just a result of culture and sitting and the fact that this wasn't taught when we were young. So we were never taught how to take a deep breath. Did anyone ever actually tell you to take a deep breath when you were a kid, outside of like, hey, go in the corner and calm down and take a deep breath?
Besides that, I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah. I've taught my kids how to take a deep breath. when they were little, and well, one of them's still pretty little, but going to bed and we'd read a book, and then we would do some stuff where I'd be like learning it would be like I was kind of trying to use a physiological sigh to help them, down regulate before they'd go to sleep. But we would do it with like animal noises, and it would always be like take 2 inhales in, and the goal would be for them to take the biggest inhale they could on the second one. So it's like, and they're just expanding as much as they can, and then we would make some sort of noise on the way out. So like buzz like a bee, bzzz, long, slow exhale. You could see what I was really doing is I was extending the exhale out and turning it into a game. But like I did that with both my kids when they were young. I didn't do it in the concept of like, I'm creating breathing champions in their life. It was more like, I want these kids to go to sleep. But yeah, I mean, at least they're being taught how to actually take a full breath. Whether or not they've retained it now, I don't know.
And there are like certain activities that like just result in more breath control, like swimming, obviously. Yep. But even like things like singing, like if you want to sing well, like you have to be able to like control your exhales and do sharp inhales.
Dude, my oldest daughter is in Taekwondo, and when she spars, a lot of times she gets a lot of like, if you didn't know better, you'd think it was asthma, but she gets a lot of like chest tension. And like it feels almost like a frog in her throat kind of deal. And I mean, I know what that is. It's CO2 retention. And it's a combination of wearing a mouth guard and being in a stressful situation. And so what we did is this was about 6 weeks ago, I started having her use the Breathe Way Better on the drive to Taekwondo. She uses it for 5 minutes.
Daddy's going to enjoy this quiet.
No. I actually I love listening. She's awesome. Both my kids are awesome. But within 2 sessions, the breathing issues, and it would get her like choked up to the point that she felt like she was going to cry.
Yeah.
And like would have to stop in the middle of training because of it. Within 2 sessions, it was gone. And it was just like a CO2 tolerance, like not breathing. And then we had a conversation about the fact that like, hey, I know we've talked about like nose breathing and how important it is to breathe through your nose, and it's healthy when you're at rest. But like when you're in a combat situation, like you want to breathe with the biggest, deepest breaths you possibly can. And it is okay to take big, fast breaths. It doesn't mean that you're because she watches the other people, and because she was in there nose breathing most of the time, she's like, they're all so out of shape. But when they would get to really high intensities, she's like, oh man, I feel like, and I was like, hey, you can't do nose breathing at high intensities. Yeah. So anyway, do I think that it can and should be taught? Potentially, if you find someone who needs it. And that made a huge difference for her.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just one of those things that it's more of like for the remote coaching side of things, it's just a challenge. I mean, even if you're in-person coaching, it's hard to see the breathing a lot of times in CrossFit. If you really pay attention, you can kind of tell, but it's not something that's like egregious, like, oh, you're not squatting to depth, like, oh, your knees are caving in on these thrusters. It's like really obvious stuff that it's like, okay, we need to address this. But like with the breathing, oftentimes it's like you got music playing, people are doing all these different functional movements. It's just kind of hard to see it too. So it's harder to coach it.
Then it comes down to having conversations with people and just kind of asking like, when you slow down, why are you slowing down? Yeah. And I think that the answer to that question often leads you to, for a lot of people, it leads you to breathing. Felt like I was suffocating. I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. I would drop the bar and just be like, and like those are the kind of answers. And when you're like, oh, okay, I think we have some things we need to address with your breathing, versus the person who's like, yeah, my legs were just on fire. Like my legs were blowing up. But sometimes that could also be related to breathing. I
was just going to say that. Like sometimes like people tell you a certain physiological term and you're like, well, it could be because of that.
It could be this. Yeah. But that also gives you the opportunity to go explore more.
Yes, we do. Guess we'll cut it off there.
Breathing.